There are moments in baseball that go beyond the scoreboard. Moments that stop conversations in dugouts, silence press boxes, and travel through locker rooms like electricity through a wire. Moments that make veterans shake their heads and rookies go quiet, unsure of what they just witnessed. What happened in the third inning of that Cubs game was one of those moments. Nobody saw it coming. Not the broadcasters. Not the analysts. Not even the Cubs manager himself, a man who has spent decades in professional baseball and believed he had seen everything the sport could produce. He had not seen this. By the time the dust settled, by the time the shouting had stopped and the water had been thrown and the words had been spoken that cannot be taken back, everyone inside that stadium understood that something had shifted. Something fundamental. Something that went far beyond a single play in a single inning of a single regular season game. The Cubs manager, visibly shaking after the final out, refused to even hear the name. "Don't mention Shohei Ohtani's name in front of me." 5 words delivered with the kind of controlled fury that only comes from a man who feels completely, utterly, and publicly humiliated. So what exactly happened in that third inning? What did Ohtani do that pushed a veteran baseball man to that breaking point? And why has Ohtani's explanation since sent shockwaves through the entire baseball world? To understand the explosion, you first have to understand what was building underneath the surface. Nothing about that game started unusually. The Cubs had prepared carefully. Their pitching staff had reviewed the scouting reports. Their defensive alignment had been adjusted specifically for Ohtani's tendencies. Their manager had walked into the pre-game meeting with quiet confidence, the kind that comes from thorough preparation and professional experience. He believed his team was ready. In the first 2 innings, everything seemed to support that belief. His pitchers were executing. His hitters were making contact. The game was progressing the way his staff had drawn it up. There was a settled feeling in the Cubs dugout, the comfortable rhythm of a team that feels in control of the moment. Then the third inning arrived. And with it, something that nobody in that stadium had a proper framework to process. What Ohtani did in that inning was not simply excellent baseball. It was something that crossed into territory that experienced observers struggle to describe without reaching for words that sound exaggerated. It was the kind of performance that makes people question whether what they are watching is actually happening in real time or whether they will wake up and discover it was something they imagined. The Cubs dugout went from settled to stunned in a matter of minutes. And the manager, watching from the top step with his arms folded and his jaw tight, felt something shift inside him. Not just frustration. Not just the competitive anger that comes from watching your game plan fail. Something deeper. Something personal. Because what Ohtani had just done felt, to him, like it wasn't supposed to be possible. It started with a pitch that the Cubs catcher called with complete confidence. The sequence had been designed to exploit a tendency their analytics team had identified after weeks of preparation. Low and away, with a specific spin rate on the breaking ball, targeting a zone that their data suggested even elite hitters struggled to handle consistently. Ohtani stood in the box with that familiar stillness. No unnecessary movement. No visible reaction to the situation. His body language communicates nothing to the pitcher, which is itself a form of psychological pressure that Cubs pitchers had described before the series as unsettling. The first pitch came in exactly as designed. Ohtani fouled it back without difficulty. Reset his stance. Stayed completely composed. The second pitch followed the same pattern, slightly adjusted. Ohtani fouled that one back too. Not with urgency. Not with the desperate foul of a hitter being fooled. With the calm, controlled contact of someone who is simply staying alive in an at-bat while he waits for what he actually wants. The Cubs dugout leaned forward. The plan was working. He was being contained. 2 pitches, 2 fouls, the count building in their favor. Then Ohtani did something that changed everything. He stepped out of the box. Took one breath. Stepped back in. and completely changed his approach in a way that made the previous two pitches entirely irrelevant. What followed was the kind of contact that silences stadiums. Not because it was unexpected in the way surprise creates silence, but because it was so complete, so total, so absolutely final that the only appropriate response from 10,000 people simultaneously is to stop making noise. The ball traveled to a part of the stadium that Cubs pitchers, after the game, said they had never seen a ball reach in that direction, off that pitch, from that count. But that was only the beginning of the third inning. What Ohtani did next, on the mound, with the ball in his hand, is what truly broke the Cubs manager. His pitching in that inning displayed a level of command and movement combination that left Cubs hitters looking not just beaten, but bewildered. Strikeouts that came on pitches that started in one location and finished somewhere that seemed to contradict the basic physics of what a baseball is supposed to do. Hitters who walked back to the dugout not with frustration on their faces, but with the particular expression of someone who is mentally replaying what just happened and finding no satisfactory explanation. 3 Cubs hitters. 3 different approaches. 3 different results that all ended the same way. By the time the third inning was over, the Cubs manager was no longer simply managing a baseball game. He was managing his own composure. And he was losing that battle. What happened after the inning ended is the part of this story that has traveled furthest beyond the baseball community. The details have been confirmed by multiple witnesses present at the stadium that evening. The confrontation began in the corridor between the dugout and the clubhouse, away from the main camera angles but not entirely out of sight. The Cubs manager, already carrying the visible weight of a game slipping away from him in ways he couldn't control, made a decision in that moment that veteran baseball people will debate for a long time. He approached the situation directly. Words were exchanged. The tone escalated faster than anyone nearby anticipated. And then, in a moment that witnesses described as shocking even by the standards of a sport where confrontations are not uncommon, the manager threw water. Not metaphorically. Not in the heat of the moment gesture that gets immediately laughed off. He threw water directly, deliberately, in Ohtani's direction. The words that accompanied that gesture are the ones that have caused the deepest and most lasting reaction. Go back to Japan. 4 words. Spoken in anger. Spoken in humiliation. Spoken by a man who had, in that moment, completely abandoned the professional standards he had maintained across an entire career. The silence that followed those words, according to everyone present, was the loudest thing that happened that entire evening. This is the part of the story that has generated the most conversation. Not the throwing of the water. Not the words themselves, as shocking as they were. But what Ohtani did next. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't match the aggression he had just been shown. He didn't gesture or react in the way that most people, confronted with that level of disrespect, would have every right to react. He looked at the Cubs manager for a long, steady moment. The kind of look that communicates far more than words typically manage. And then he spoke. His explanation, delivered quietly and without theatrics, is what has since caused a stir across the baseball world. Ohtani said, simply, that he understood. Not that he agreed. Not that the behavior was acceptable. But that he understood where the anger was coming from. He said that when someone gives everything they have to prepare and still feels powerless, that frustration has to go somewhere. He said he had felt that feeling himself, in moments earlier in his career, and that it was one of the most difficult emotions a competitor can carry. He said he hoped the manager would find peace with it. And then he walked away. No media statement. No dramatic gesture. No attempt to claim the moral high ground publicly in a way that would further humiliate the man who had just disrespected him in front of witnesses. Just those quiet words. And then silence. What Ohtani said in that corridor traveled quickly. By the time both teams had completed their post-game routines, the story had moved beyond the stadium walls. Baseball people who heard the account of his response reacted with a mixture of admiration and disbelief. Not because composure under pressure is unheard of in professional sports, but because the specific nature of what had been said to him, and the specific way he chose to respond, revealed something about his character that statistics and highlight reels simply cannot capture. Several veteran players, when told the details of the exchange, said the same thing in different ways. Most people, at that level, in that moment, don't respond like that. The Cubs manager, for his part, issued a statement through the organization that acknowledged the confrontation and expressed regret for words spoken in the heat of competition. The statement was carefully worded, professionally composed. Everything that his behavior in the corridor had not been. Baseball observers noted the contrast immediately. The player behaved with more dignity than the manager. The person being disrespected responded with more grace than the person doing the disrespecting. That gap, between how Ohtani was treated and how he chose to respond, became the central conversation across the sport in the days that followed. Strip away the drama. Remove the water and the shouting and the words that should never have been spoken. What remains is something genuinely worth examining. Ohtani's response in that corridor was not a performance. It was not a calculated public relations move designed to protect his image. There were no cameras pointed at him. There was no audience beyond the small group of witnesses who happened to be present. He responded that way because that is who he is. This is the part of Ohtani's story that his performance numbers, as extraordinary as they are, cannot fully tell. The discipline that governs his diet, his training, his physical preparation, that same discipline governs how he moves through the world when baseball is not being played. He has spoken in the past, in limited ways, about the philosophy that guides him. About the belief that how you respond to difficult moments matters more than the moments themselves. About the understanding that a person's character is not revealed when things are going well, but when everything around them is hostile and unfair. The corridor outside the Cubs' dugout was exactly that kind of moment. And Ohtani passed through it exactly the way the people who know him best would have predicted. The Cubs manager eventually sat down for his post-game press conference. He was composed by then. Professional. Answering questions about pitching decisions and lineup construction with the practiced ease of a man who has done this thousands of times. A reporter asked about Ohtani. The manager's jaw tightened. His eyes went somewhere else for just a fraction of a second. Then he brought himself back to the room, back to the microphone, back to the professional performance that the situation required. "Don't mention Shohei Ohtani's name in front of me." He said it almost quietly. Without the fury of the corridor. Just the flat, exhausted statement of a man who has run out of ways to process what he experienced. The room went silent. Because everyone in that press conference understood what those words actually meant. They didn't mean he was angry at Ohtani. They meant he was overwhelmed by him. By the performance. By the response in the corridor. By the humbling reality that he had prepared as thoroughly as he knew how, deployed his best strategies, sent his best players to execute them, and still walked away feeling like he had brought a carefully constructed plan to a confrontation with something that plans cannot contain. That is what Shohei Ohtani does to opposing managers. Not just in the box score. Not just on the mound. In every dimension of the game. In every interaction. In every moment when character is tested and most people would choose the easier path. He is a different kind of player. And after what happened in that third inning, after what was said in that corridor, and after the explanation that has since caused a stir across the entire baseball world. Even the Cubs manager, furious as he was, already knows it.